the books that shaped my world. Literally, I'm not going to talk about the books that I've read that shaped my world. I've read a few books where there are words on a page and they unfold in a kind of linear sequence, and you go from beginning to end and comprehend the book. And some of those books are incredible, and I could talk about those, but I'd like to talk about other aspects of my relationship with books that don't have to do with reading them. Primarily, it has to do with looking at books, because I love to look at books, but also browsing books in libraries and bookstores, collecting books, obsessively sometimes, organizing, editing, curating, because one's library eventually is the shape of one's world. So, the book is a little rectangle. It's a frame on the world. Each page of the book is a little rectangular frame. When it's a kind of linear sequence of words, that's one way of filling the frame up and comprehending it. But also, an illustration in a book is seen within a frame, and it is seen to be some kind of picture on the world. And you can imagine this as almost kind of successive frames within frames within frames, which is a theme that I pick up with my freshman architects, and I will be reiterating tonight. So it's a fragment of the universe. There's a great continuum, and you're looking at a portion of that continuum which is selected for your viewing. Also, I want to say I don't usually talk too much about my private life as opposed to my public life, but since this is the books that shape my world, I am going to talk about some kind of personal aspects. So I hope you will indulge my solipsism. So to begin with with my oldest recognizable ancestor, this is Ida Schmeickus, my great-grandmother on my father's side in the old country, where all of the families ultimately came from the Jewish Pale of Settlement in an area that was sometimes Ukraine, sometimes Russia. History goes on, and it's the same old story. So Ida lived there, and she died there. My two grandfathers on the left-hand side, the son of Ida Schmeickus, Wolf Schmeickus on the left-hand side. Don't ask me what this photograph is about. It just turned up in the family archives somehow, and it's an incredible photograph. I don't know why these Ukrainian teenagers were pretending to be gauchos, but there they are. And then the other one is my maternal grandfather, Sam Turco, also in the old country. These two guys were born at exactly the same time. They left Ukraine at exactly the same time to avoid conscription, a story that still goes on, which in those days was completely a death sentence. And they never knew each other until their children got married like 30 years later. So I'm going to follow Wolf because he's the grandfather that I knew the best. And he left Ukraine in 1913. He showed up in St. Louis soon afterwards as William Samuels. And you know, that's the Ellis Island story of how they got their names. And he married Fanny, and they started having children, 5 children. On the left-hand side is Bernard, my father. And in the early days, Wolf, later William, operated a dry goods store, a family business. And this was probably in Cape Girardeau, Missouri. This is the late 20s, early 30s, bad time to be in business in general. And there kept being these floods along the Mississippi, and they kept moving downstream. So moving from St. Louis to Cape Girardeau to the one and only Paragould, the town in Arkansas that I come from. And you can see here the genealogy of the name. It's the crossing of the railroads that were owned by Robert Baron, Jay Gould, and presumed Robert Baron, I guess, Don Paramore, a much smaller scale baron, who, in some wag, responded to a contest to name the town by combining the two names. So William got out of the dry goods business and he got into the scrap metal and hide business, Samuels Hide and Metal Company. This is what I knew as a kid and where I worked many, many summers. This is my father on the left, grandfather in the middle, and Uncle Sam on the right-hand side. Paragould may have had the one and only name, Paragould, but it was actually a pretty common Main Street town of about 8,000 type of town you see all over the Mid-South, Midwest. But it was still, when I grew up, it was a Main Street town, and that's the street that I hung out, bicycled down there, hung out, and went to the Woolworths to buy model airplanes, drugstore to buy books, and we all look back on that as a kind of, golden time, all of us who were there. My father, when he was stationed at Aberdeen Proving Ground in Maryland, hooked up with this woman and convinced her to leave Baltimore and come to the one and only Paragould, where they had me. Thank you. Oh. So, I grew up in a house that did not really have books. We were not a book house. We had this thing right here, which was the Book of Knowledge. And this was from 1927, 1928. It's inscribed, the first volume of it is inscribed with my mother and her brother as they were kids, obviously. And this is where the images that really formed my whole life came from. I was telling Natalie's father, Tom Caldwell, this story about how important this was to me and how my brother had gotten them all when my parents passed away and I didn't have access to it. He said, "Oh, I've got that." And of course, I didn't believe it, the exact same one. Well, it wasn't exactly the exact same one, but when he gave it to me, 25 volumes of it, and it was pretty much the same one. So the images in this book are seared into my brain. I mean, these are the first pictures I ever looked at. And for instance, how long does it take for a train to get to the different planets? Of course, that was the only way to get there in those days. And let me get my notes down because I've got some numbers I want to tell you. So on the side of each train, it has how many years it takes to get there. 188 days to get to the moon, 76 years to Mars. And you can see, these tracks are on solid footing, and then they just take off into the air. Great, fantastic image. And then there's a lot of text in these, but I never read the text. All I did was look at the pictures. Sometimes I would read the captions on the pictures. But this selection of pages on bridges, a caisson that goes down below the surface to dig the footings of a bridge, a plate on the Quebec and the Firth of Forth Bridge. Both of those bridges, incidentally, were disaster relief bridges. They were bridges that were built after the original bridge fell down, and they were built with, they were over-engineered, let's say. And the Firth of Forth Bridge, just one of my favorite bridges of all time. And dirigibles, airships. I mean, these things, this is the opposite. Instead of heavy engineering, this is just the most lacy, lightweight aluminum structure you can make. So it has, so that the hydrogen can actually lift it up. This is, of course, before Hindenburg. But I love this picture looking down the gangway where you see the different tanks and all of the structure there. And airplanes, Michael. These were the first airplanes that I ever saw. And I love this, just all collaged together in a single image, or especially this one of a bulldozer pulling the airplane. These kind of plates, like, this is in 1927, it's a different stage of science, but the controller, the homunculus in the head, controlling all of the various functions of the body. Extraordinary beetles and strange caterpillars. These pages, though, just really impressed me, these fantastic creatures. I don't know why did they do an article on fantastic creatures? Sea serpents. But these images, again, emblazoned on my mind. So you can see that there is, on the one hand, this kind of rational engineering aesthetic, but also this kind of fantastic stream that's running off on the side. At the very front of the book, tipped in by hand, was this plate announcing Lindbergh's flight to Paris in 1927. So this is probably 28, 29. And I was quite taken with this, the notion of the young guy who solos off into the sky. And then the book report that I wrote on that in the 6th grade, which is, this book was actually just published in 1954, so it's rather late. Lindbergh had been around for a while, and it won the Pulitzer Prize in 1954 for some reason. And there was a movie in 1957 by Billy Wilder where James Stewart, at age 48, played Lindbergh as age 27. Didn't quite work, but it wasn't totally bad. That script was co-written between Billy Wilder and the brother of my 7th grade science teacher, Mrs. Mays. Wendell Mays wrote the script. And later I went on to read the Scott Berg biography of Lindbergh. Of course, he is quite a fraught character who, after this, the marriage to Anne Morrow, the enormous publicity, the kidnapping of the baby, the America First, and go to Germany and look at the production of airplanes under, strange circumstances, and then his flying during World War II. But I think, to me, the most interesting twist of his whole career was, in the end, he became an ecologist. He lived in Hawaii, and he was one of the first promoting a kind of ecologist approach to living. Anyway, book written, a typewritten. Are you going to say something, Michael?
Well, since you're on Lindbergh, I wanted to remind you that Lindbergh visited the Rice Airfield in 1926.
I did not know that, but there you go. Straight from the Houston's historical source on aviation, Michael Bloodworth. Thank you. I hand typed this out, and I made the illustration. During these days, for some reason, I just loved airplanes. And children's books of airplanes, but I love this one in particular. And this illustration, Michael, is that a DC-3 or a DC-4?
Yes.
It's a little bit of both, right? Well, I love looking into the airplane, and then when you look down and you see these kind of cubic house structures, it did occur to me that the very first library that I ever hung out at, the Greene County Library in Paragould, Arkansas, is in one of those houses. I mean, look at this. Those four houses and this library that I vaguely remember, this photograph is whatever I could find from an archivist, but I do dimly remember that. I remember riding my bike there, hanging out in that library, and especially checking out this book, Keogh's book, Flying Saucers from Outer Space. And not necessarily checked out at that time, but read during that time. I loved The Twilight Zone. And this whole, once again, this whole kind of thing between rational and intuitive and fantastic. A few years later, I discovered that you could check out these 78 RPM record sets. So that, and I remember the first one I checked out was Beethoven's Third Symphony. I didn't know anything about classical music, but I checked it out, and it's like the whole symphony is on 6 or 7 records that were heavy clay records, and you'd stack them up on one side and go through the whole thing in sequence, and then for the first half, and then you flip them over and do the other half. I went through all of Beethoven's symphonies and Mozart and Brahms, and I learned a lot about classical music until I got to Rice, and John taught me about rock music. So one of the things, being young in those days, was we had a congregation in Jonesboro, 20 miles away, and we would go to Friday night services and Saturday morning shul. And at this point, I'm studying for my bar mitzvah, but what made that really worthwhile is that after lunch, I could go to Walgreens and get a cheeseburger, and I could go to Tom's Hobby Shop, and I could go to the library. Which, this building, I remember this very clearly. This building is still, this is a contemporary photograph of it, but it looked just about like that in those days. And the one book I remember from this place was this book. And once again, I was fascinated by this book because of the visual images in it. Joe, thank you for reminding me about libraries in your talk. So, and yoga also. Nobody knew anything about yoga in those days, but I mean, no Americans did. But these cleansing exercises fascinated me, where you take a strip of linen and clean out all your tubes. So, little did I know then that I would become a practitioner, 35 years later, and still am for that matter. Another book which I probably just picked up at the drugstore was 1, 2, 3 Infinity by George Gamow, the physicist. He had a real sense of humor. He was a physicist who, among many other things, almost jokingly proposed the Big Bang idea. And he didn't realize it then. It was sort of proposed it against the steady state model of Fred Hoyle, I think it was, which was the generally accepted model of the universe that constantly regenerates itself. But Gamow's joke was true. And I read this book many times when I was a kid, but I especially loved the illustrations that he made, these little hand sketches of different aspects of physics and infinity and cosmology, space-time, biology, but just these kind of little offhand sketches that just had so much humor in them. So I was struggling in those days to draw myself, and among other things, I had this project for myself to draw these 3-view drawings of a lot of airplanes that I liked, and I copied them. I'm about 11 or 12 years old here, maybe 10, 11, 12, and I copied them out of books freehand, and then I went over them with ballpoint pens, and there's a series of about 30 of those. But I was struggling. So the book that really, this book really literally shapes my world. This is how an aspiration to be able to draw more precisely in scale engineering drawing by Thomas French, which is the best of these kind of books. And I got myself a T-square and a triangle, just like the illustration. And I lusted after a drawing instrument set. I actually even wrote to the altimeter company in Philadelphia, and they priced a special set for me that had the pieces that I want. And it was, probably $70 or something, but way beyond what a 12-year-old kid could afford. I got a cheap set, but as it turned out, a few years ago, I got the alternator set that I always wanted. Actually, you can find these things on eBay now. I've got a compulsive collection of drawing instrument sets too. And I was able to make this drawing, among others. The lines are straight, parallel, they're in scale, and this was a pivotal drawing for me because this enabled me, this got the attention of our local architect, who sort of took me under his wings and started me doing, just simple drawings, grids and ink. And but the day I walked into his office, it was like my life changed. It was like, okay, forget airplanes, I'm gonna be an architect. And he listened to classical music, and that was when I started getting interested in classical music. So I started thinking about architecture. So this, folks, is the very first thing I ever designed as a building. And it's the Greene County, the Paragould Library. I guess my mind is just running along libraries here. And then this whole freehand sketch. And then the actual drawing for this is probably age 13 or so. But this is the beginning of a new phase of my life, a kind of aspirational phase where I'm starting to think beyond, the Book of Knowledge and Paragould, the one and only, and get into this book, by the way, was very important. Who would think that a encyclopedia of architectural details would be very important to a 13-year-old kid? But believe me, it was. And I love these drawings and the kind of typography style and the whole cult behind that. But I went to a summer session at Andover at Phillips Academy, and boy, there was a library there, and there was an art gallery, and there was a wood shop, and there was all kinds of stuff there. And so I went there for 2 years for my junior and senior year in high school. The first thing I found there was this Frank Lloyd Wright book that I carried around with me for weeks. And I love these color pencil drawings in this kind of particular style that Wright's Atelier used. And I never saw that book again for another 50 years until recently. Will and I started talking about this, and I found out there is a copy here, which is up at the front. And I finally got my copy of this. So my drawings are much improved. I've learned it, ink and sepia in the style of Frank Lloyd Wright, parallel lines and everything. And that is 1963. But I did start to develop more of my own kind of architectural style there, to the point where at the end of my handover time, I won the art prize, and then came to Rice. No connection to Rice, no connection to Houston. I didn't know anything about it. I'd never been here. I just washed up here, and even more incredible library in which we sit right now, in the fine arts room where we're going to adjourn to in a little while. Over the last 50 years, I've spent a lot of time in this building, prowling around, looking, finding, just browsing the shelves and grabbing what might look interesting, putting down all of the word books, and really picking up and looking at the picture books, like this early edition, 1910 edition of the Grammar of Ornament by Owen Jones. Beautiful example of the lithographic art. Incredible plates in there with little tissue sleeves in each plate, like so. Depending on where you browse, where you prowl, you find different things. So in the architecture section, this book, which had an enormous impact on me because of the images in it, Conrad Waxman's The Turning Point of Building, had the Firth of Forth Bridge in it, and the Crystal Palace by James Paxton. I mean, this was the first time I'd ever seen the Crystal Palace, and there are a number of pages in the book about that. I was just quite taken with this kind of manufactured building that was built so quickly in 1851. The idea of these kind of dimensional rasters for panelized construction systems. And this must be one of the great images. A model of an airplane hangar built by students of Waxman. And this, I don't know what the hell this is, but I mean, this is some fantasy drawing made by hand in the 1950s by some architecture student. You'd be hard put to do that on a computer now, but look at that, that's an amazing drawing. So, here at Rice, we had a lot of connections to Ames and the Saarinen office. I put this up, Powers of 10, because the film was so important to me. And the book is a kind of description of the film in its second version, but the film that I really loved was, I think it was called a working print for Powers of 10, where it's just a kind of sketch of the ultimate film, which goes from the very smallest to the very largest in the universe through, I can't remember how many powers of 10, but this is frame within frame within frame, but each frame gets bigger by a factor of 10 as you move through it. Starts with a family having a picnic on the lakeshore of Chicago, and starts to zoom out and goes all the way to the edge of the known universe at that time, and then zooms back in 10 times as fast, back to the guy's hand, and then goes inside his hand down to the smallest thing that they knew at the time. Science has advanced quite a bit since those days, and they had some of the extremities of this were done with artwork, but now there's actual imagery to be able to do that. So, just going to add a little bit. I'm not even going to give you any numbers. One thing I found out, this is just a note, a side note, is that Charles Eames designed a building, a church, in the one and only Paragould. A little Catholic church that was in no way any premonition of the work that the Eames office would do later. But it was enough so that Eliel Sermon invited Eames to come to Cranbrook and study there, where he met Arrow Sermon. And soon after, I guess it was either there or soon after, when he met Ray. When I asked the Eames Foundation why did his style shifted so much from these, there are two churches in Arkansas, both in this kind of romantic, classic mode. The answer was Ray. So, back to life at school in 1967. I was fortunate to be on a little team with a few students working with Guillermo Julian de la Fuente, who this is 2 years after Corbu died. Julian and Uberby were working for Corbu. Paul Kennan, who was our teacher, who came from the Arrow Sermon office, went to Paris, went to the 35 Rue de Sèvres atelier. Of course, Corbu was gone, but he met Julian, and they became fast friends and drinking buddies. So I was on this little team for 2 weeks to look at the design for the Venice Hospital, probably the greatest building ever built. But I did get to work on it for several years because we did a little book, Architecture Advice number 27. It was sold, it was published and sold, and the proceeds of that book sent me as a preceptor to Paris and to Venice. So there we are on the site of the hospital. I'm on the left-hand side. 2 people over from me is Julian, and spent some very interesting time there working on this project. I was fascinated by the drawing style of Corbu. Julian said he did not come to Bryce to make little Corbus out of us, but it was kind of inadvertent. We became little Corbus anyway. And when I got to Paris, I got the little notebooks like Corbu had used. I even did the rubber stamp identifications on them. And I drew, as I traveled, I drew with a Pro Quill pen in the style of Corbu. And a way of, what I learned from the Corbu sketches is a way of looking at something that is not like not drawing what's there, but what you understand to be there, the kind of underlying relationships that are there. And making little notations, personal notations of these. Probably nobody else can even figure out I can't even figure out what I was getting at then. But there it is. I mean, it's page after page after page of these little notes to self, which I have continued doing. I mean, for me, this, the whole idea of the image, the picture, it boils down to the essential of what little does it take to communicate some ideas to yourself, to others, mostly to self. I mean, these are the kind of sketches I make when I'm preparing a talk for students. I love this one. I had to work on this a little bit this morning. But what you see from your eyeball, if you close one eye, there is the axis of symmetry here, perpendicular to the surface of the earth, perpendicular to the horizon, which is right at eye level, and there's a ground and there's an air, and the ground comes toward you, and down on the side is your nose, as part of what you see in that frame of the view. But when you switch it over, the nose cancels out, fortunately. So what you see is not exactly a rectangular frame, but you can inscribe a rectangular frame around it of the proportions about 9 to 16, which is just such a kind of basic proportion, the proportion of the screens, of paper, of all different kinds of things. So cinema, 9 to 16 television. That's sort of an aside. And more sketches, these are just little things to talk to students or record my ideas. So getting back to this notion of browsing the stats right here, actually literally the stats right back there. I found this book, Anonymous Sculpture, Anonyme Sculpture. I don't make any pretense about the pronunciation of this, of anything, even my great-grandmother's name. But this is a book by the Beckers, who were photographers in Germany in the 1950s, who photographed industrial sites, and they got just kind of clinical photographs. They've gotten more and more famous with this approach, to the point where I finally got that book. It's a beautiful book. At the Met right now, there's a major Becker show, and they've enshrined that book in plexiglass, as if it's like the greatest thing ever. I can tell you that the photographic printing on this book is not very good, but the catalog is much better now. So they shot, this is from the Met show, they shot these kind of industrial sites in Germany and arranged them into different kinds of, they called them typologies. I think this one, though, is more of a morphology, because it has to do more with the shapes of things and the functions of them. I have compulsively collected all the Becker books I could get my hands on, so I made this little photo montage in the style of the Beckers of the covers of their own books from my library. Have I mentioned the compulsion of collecting? So, inspired by Walker Evans and the Beckers and Christenberry and the new topographics photographers who came along, who were institutionalized in 1975 with a major show and catalog. These are photographers of the American landscape. So I started doing mine too, cruising the back roads of Texas and Arkansas and Louisiana, shooting in a very deliberate Beckerian sense these little storefronts. And that resulted in a show, a little show at the Brazos bookstore sponsored by Carl Killian. And I want to say, I've been talking about browsing the stacks of the libraries and all the importance of the different libraries to me. But I should say that when I got back from Europe, I started browsing bookstores everywhere and compulsively acquiring books. There was Carl's bookstore on Bissonnette, not where it is now, it's across the street. Mary Ross Rhine's bookstore a few blocks down the street. That was Saturday morning, it was just to cruise around those two. Or to go into New York and go to Yop Rietman, or Urban Center, or Chicago and Prairie Avenue, or Los Angeles and Hennessy and Ingalls, or Paris and Monitor, or London and Foyles, almost all of those bookstores are gone now. So the great period of bookstore browsing, I think for various reasons is over. But I had fun. Every time I'd come back from a trip, it would be 4 suitcases full of books. There were some from Italy as well. So, is it just me, or do people like to collect stuff? So, one other thing I started collecting about that time were these 1 to 200 model airplanes. And I've got now, these are handmade items, but this is going back to my fascination with airplanes and the design of airplanes and the kind of, design with very strict constraints that results in a form that you cannot deny has some kind of aesthetic component to it, even though that's not part of the intention of it. So to me, that's what was so interesting about the little model airplanes. But now I've gotten to know all of these guys who made them. Most of them have croaked now. But actually, the one with the red plane up there in Amsterdam has just made a new one for me. So I have, in 2003, I realized this was the 100th anniversary of the Wright brothers flight. I saw these glass cases out here, and I thought, that would make a great exhibit of my models of the history of aviation. So I convinced Lee Pesh to let me do that. And I did, and it was, of course my collection now is like 4 times that size. Well, what I found was there was a Rice professor before me who was also an aviation fanatic who set up the Anderson collection. And in the Anderson collection is this book, which I think is, I found this on the stacks downstairs. It's a kind of review of the products of this Italian airplane company from 1910 to 1930 something. And very analytical, complete drawings, photographs, just as a kind of industrial archaeology of what they had made. I love this book so much I had to track it down and finally found it in Trento. So at the same time, this is a pivot point in my life when my educational days are pretty much over, my professional days are beginning. I fell in with these guys, and we started, by the way, that's John Casbarian on the right, Timme. First we started Architects InCahoots and Associates, and then it became Taft Architects as we got more serious. And I moved into Isabella Courts. And this was really the beginning of trying to continue to organize the books that I continued to acquire. So from dialing it all back just a little bit, from the Atelier in Paris, there were these little modular boxes that followed Corbu's modular dimensions. That is, series of golden succession of proportions scaled to parts of the human body. So that little box is a kind of ideal size for sitting, for making a desk, for making a book shelf. And I saw that as a kind of answer to, in those days, this problem of how am I going to shape my world of books, which is a very personal thing. I mean, that's like your computer desktop or something. So yours is different from everybody else's. So in Isabella Courts, I made 24 of these little boxes. I think 6 or 8 of them I have stereo equipment and records in them. So my library was pretty small at that point. Since then, every time I moved, I made more boxes. So this is the part 4, and You can see the dining room off to the right is stacks of books that are just as dense as you can get. Finally, I ran out of space there and moved in Howard Barnston's Graustark apartments, which had more space to make books. 16 feet wide, but plenty of wall space for books. And then finally, where I live now, which is also 16 feet wide and 3 stories high, with plenty of wall space. And this is a different way that books have shaped my world. It's like living in these books, you know. It's like, you know, the illustration of the brain. But here it's 3 stories of solid books, and the question of how do you arrange these things is critical. Because how you arrange it, how you conceive of it, is really the world you're shaping. So on the first floor, it's like a 40-foot run of books, and these are not the boxes, but inset within these are little display areas. And then on the second floor begins in earnest the architecture and design books, and architecture on the left, urbanism on the high stack, design on the low run, and yeah, some airplanes stuck in there too. This is a 15-foot room, and so urbanism on the left, design, everything from industrial design to quilts and patterns and craft design on the right. And looking down on it, never before seen. And then coming up to the third floor, which is where all my favorite books are, and also, oh, I forgot to mention cranes and trucks and others too. And I'm not going to dwell on this, and especially since we're running out of time, but these 4 boxes are the books that are, I've just put my most important books into these boxes. And they tend towards science, but also The Way of Zen by Alan Watts, and, you know, speculative books and philosophical books, history of technology, evolution of this and that. If anybody's interested, I'll give you titles off of those. And here, finally, this is really my world, because this is all about, this is 313 boxes of 7,800 and some odd books, all in a single composite image. Thank you.
All right, I think we've got a few minutes for questions, and I see
4
we're
minutes.
on here.
You didn't take too much time.
Do you ever find yourself buying a duplicate because you couldn't find the book you wanted in all those boxes?
No, I know where every single book is.
That's impressive.
I do have a problem, and sometimes I'll buy, a book will look different, and I'll buy a second one. So on my phone, I have photographs of all of the boxes, and I know where the books are, and I can tell whether I already have that book or not. And I know where they are.
I need to talk to you. Another question.
Yeah.
Does it bother you that you haven't finished the rectangle at the bottom?
No, it's not. I'm not making any more boxes. These things take forever to make. That's just how you divide it up, but I think it's like 300. It's, you know, it doesn't divide it up well. So that doesn't bother me. I like a little bit of, you know, fantasy.
7 stages, that's the future.
No, it's like, I've reached a point where if I buy a new book, I have to get rid of an old one, put it in storage or something. I do have books in storage. Yes, ma'am.
Did you ever come across the drawings of Chesley Bonestell? Did you come across the drawings, the space drawings of Chesley Bonestell?
Yes, I love his
Do you have those
drawings.
books?
I do. I have one book. I don't know if there are more than, if there's more than
There
one.
were two.
Chesley Bonestell? Is
Bonestell.
that Bonestell? His drawings are as fantastic as his name is. I love that.
Your books that you said that you collect, is that because of the patterns? Or are you interested in quilts specifically?
That's hard to answer. I mean, I'm interested in certain kind of clusters of ideas, and where books fit into those clusters of ideas, I'm interested in that book. But mostly I'm interested in beautiful illustrated books, but not only. Did I answer your question?
Sort
Okay, close enough.
It'll take a longer conversation.
We can talk more.
All righty, well, I have a couple of things here to close us out. Number one being to thank Professor Samuels for this amazing presentation. We have a small gift for you to say thank you. I hope you get to use it and display it along with your books. Not tonight, not tonight.
Thank you, I need this.
And I just have to say personally, this presentation was eye-opening to me. I mean, very visually oriented, and I much think of books as words, and it was just wonderful to hear how the pictures in books have shaped your life. I also noticed that you made an A on your St. Louis report, and I can see why, because I think this presentation tonight was an A++. So let's give him another round.